We're excited about today's event. It's been a great following Lynn for many years on social media. Susan and I have both paid attention to him and kept an eye on what he's been doing. I'll be introducing him in just a minute, but we're just excited to hear from Lynn one-on-one today. We want this little housekeeping things. We want this to be a conversational type interaction. Lynn has some slides to present, but we want your questions. You can put them in the chat. You can raise your hands. We'll try to get to you. We'll save time at the end for more questions. But we really want this to be an interactive and exciting event and a learning and a meaningful experience for everyone. For those who don't know about Brandjectory, because I see some people on here who aren't part of our membership, which is fine. We want you here. That's fantastic. Brandjectory is an engagement and education platform for brands under 10 million in sales. All the brands you see at Whole Foods, whether they be food, beverage, alcohol, non-alcohol, health, wellness, pet brands have been on Brandjectory, any kind of personal care, intimate care. And what we do is provide some education through an extensive knowledge base and webinars like this. And every month, a series of virtual meetings that involve experts and investors in the industry, chance to meet investors, work with investors, get to know investors, hear from experts, ask questions directly about capital raising and legal issues and chance to work with fellow founders. All that is what we do on Brandjectory to give brands a chance to grow and to really get familiar with not just what CPG is, but who are the people in CPG and how those people can help them. So that's what Brandjectory is. I'll put some contact information in there for me and Susan in just a moment in the chat. And I'm going to turn it over to Lynn to introduce himself. But Susan, as I mentioned, Susan and I have followed Lynn for a lot of years on social media. I've seen a lot of his videos. He works with some incredibly interesting people, and I apologize for DJ. He works with some incredibly interesting people, some of the really top-notch people in health and wellness and in other industries. So we're excited to have him here. What we have been saying is, Lynn Graft was talking about storytelling before storytelling was a story. Because I think he's the original who started to really focus on how brands can tell a story and how that founder can get his message across. I'm going to let Lynn take it from here and finish the introductions, but we're excited to have him here, and I'm really hoping everyone enjoys the conversation today. Lynn, please take it away.
Thanks, Tom. Just for context, from a background standpoint, I started out as a founder of a company, and I'll get into a little bit about what that represents. But essentially, I came from the entrepreneur's perspective. I had an electrical engineering degree, and then I got my MBA, and then I did a startup soon after working in corporate America. So I really didn't know that much about storytelling. And then the company I was with, we went on this incredible journey where we raised over $7 million. We had $1 million in revenue at the time. We had some big name customers. We're on the cover of New York Times, Wall Street Journal. And I was able to leverage kind of our story to get us pressed before I really knew even how to. I got a little bit of a gift of gab, but some of the things I was surrounded by some really successful founders. But that company ended up as a rocket ship taking off, and then it exploded incredibly badly during the dot-com crash. So we were on the cover of the Wall Street Journal one time for how well we were doing, and then we were on the cover of USA Today for how bad we did. So I kind of got both ends of the spectrum along those lines. But after that company imploded, I went down this journey, and I was a consultant for a while, and then I did another startup, had a nice little exit. And my best friend, who I was with in that first company, she approached me and says, "Hey, I'd really like to do this television show about women CEOs raising capital in Texas in the high-tech sector." I didn't know anything about television or video or script writing. And I'm like, "I'll help you." So 5 hours a week turned into 10 hours a week. And I went down this journey with her about the process of creating and pitching a television show featuring high-profile women entrepreneurs. And that evolved over time. And as I was kind of making a living at that, so to speak, we had an opportunity to film different folks for different projects. So I did a project for the University of Texas, and then there was an entrepreneur event here in Austin as I'm making more and more content featuring small business owners and entrepreneurs. And this gentleman on screen, I got to film here at this Rise entrepreneurial event here in Austin, Texas. And he was Blake Mykoski, and he had just got done with a startup that also failed in California. He was trying to get a reality television show network going, and it really crashed badly. It was very public because a lot of the press in Los Angeles had written about it, and then when it crashed, he had a very public failure. So he decided to go down to Argentina with a group of friends and just kind of get away from it all. And this is part of the story that he's telling on camera to us as I'm filming him for this project. And he talks about when he went into Argentina, he was in a city and he was just kind of relaxing. But while he's there, he ran into some other friends that were there to do a shoe drop. And he wasn't familiar with that, but they asked him if he would come along. And he discovered that what they do is they take shoes donated from the United States and they take it to the really impoverished areas around the major cities. They call them favelas. And these are really, really poor folks. And some of them live in the jungle, some of them live in these really poor area favelas, and some just kind of live in the outskirts of the city. So what they do is they find these families and they drive up and they pass out pairs of shoes for the needy families. And what he thought, wow, this is really powerful. It'll give me a way to kind of get out of my own skin and really not worry about that failure. Let me just focus on giving and helping other people. But while he's there, he met this woman that had 2 children. And prior to the shoe drop, she had decided which one of her children was able to get an education because she only had enough money to buy 1 pair of shoes. And he was really struck at his core by that discovery, that the fact that this woman was choosing which of her children would get an education simply because she didn't have enough money for a second pair of shoes. And that struck him strongly. He's like, oh my God, I got to do something about that. He goes back to his hotel room and starts iterating. Okay, how can I help this? I don't want to do a nonprofit because I'll be raising money all the time and just giving money away. I'm more of a capitalist. At the same time, I don't want to take advantage of these really poor people that need this product. What can I do? And he's writing in his journal. And one of the things he wrote as he's iterating on the idea was, wait a second, what about this 1-for-1 exchange? And he called it the 1-for-1 model. And the premise was that if I can convince someone in the United States to buy a pair of shoes, we'll build a model so that we can give an equal pair of shoes to a family in need, such as those families outside of that Argentinian town. So he goes back to California and he uses that story to galvanize his friends, raise a little money from some angels, convince people to give him supplies to start this process, gets a little press, finds a retail outlet, and a little pop-up, and then eventually starts selling shoes. And eventually it became Tom's Shoes. And he was really known for creating that 1-for-1 model that many of you have seen with Warby Parker and socks and a lot of other models that are out there that have replicated that 1-for-1 exchange. And he was like, wow, this was a great business and it took off. But there was one instance he told us as he's telling the story, he's going along, and he says, it was a great story. It was a great opportunity. I was able to give back and make money, and they had a nice exit. But he says one of the things that really struck him more than any other experience, other than that woman with the 2 children, is he's traveling cross country and he's in the Midwest, somewhere in Tulsa, Oklahoma, I believe. And he's at an airport and he's got a layover between his next flight. And while there was a woman who was standing in line trying to talk to the desk clerk there to arrange her flight. And she's wearing a pair of the Tom shoes. And you can see the Tom shoes are very distinct. They're called espadrilles back in the day. And he's wearing a pair right there. And he recognizes the shoes. He goes up to this woman. He goes, oh, wow, I really love your shoes. And the woman turns to him and says, oh my God, have you heard of it? It's called Tom's Shoes. If you buy a pair of shoes, this needy family in another third world country gets a free pair of shoes. And he's like, kind of smiles and stuff. He's very proud. So that's really cool. He starts walking away. And the woman, she grabs his arm, shakes him like this. Says, no, you don't understand. If you buy a pair of shoes, this family somewhere in the world gets a free pair of shoes. And he's like, okay, lady, I get it. I get it. And in that moment, he had this revelation about the power of story. Here he is in the middle of nowhere, USA, approaching a stranger, and she's evangelizing for him. She's grabbing him, this passionate desire to share his idea, his product, his business model in a way that he'd never experienced other businesses that way. And I'm sitting here filming this, going, oh, I got goosebumps. I was so excited, man, this is awesome. And it was in that moment that I decided I really wanted to learn more about storytelling. And I continued down this journey, and I've been fortunate over the years to film a number of high-profile founders, the founder of Starbucks and LinkedIn, Pandora and Whole Foods. It's just something I was able to kind of iterate on and develop what eventually became that television show that we pitched and got it secured on CNBC. It was called American Made, and it was an hour-long profile shows on the most successful founders of these companies, such as Starbucks and Playboy and Clear Channel and a lot of other things like that. And for me, it was a journey that I continued on. And I still, to this day, because I was so enamored by the power of story, specifically for founders and entrepreneurs, because that's who I was filming. And I've spent about 20,000 hours really dedicating learning the art and the science of entrepreneurial storytelling. And I still have continued to be a founder. I've had, 9 or so startups. I got 3 wins, more losses though, and I got 2 that I'm working on right now and continue to get press. And one of the things that I've really tried to do in that process is help founders learn from my experience, because it wasn't, I was trained in storytelling in the traditional way. And I didn't go to what they call RTF, radio, television, film, or film school, if you will. I wasn't trained in that. I was surrounded by these really successful founders telling their story in such a way that it's going to help them drive press, get sales, raise capital, recruit. And I was always around that. And that's ended up going on a 6-year journey writing a book. And there are some things I want to share with you today in terms of what I learned from why stories work so well. And then we're going to dive into some specific things that I want you to take away from this process. And feel free to jump in and ask questions. Tom, I'm going to let you interrupt me because I can't see if there's any questions that are coming in through the chat. So you just tell me, said, hey, we got a question, and I'll stop for that.
I
So
will.
This is meant to be a collaborative session. I'm going to share my knowledge with you, my experience, but I'm happy to tailor. We've got time. We've got a small group here, so we can happy to dive in as deep as you want to go down each particular rabbit trail. So first and foremost, one of the things that I learned, or I should say 3 of the things that I learned in talking to neuroscientists, sociologists, psychologists, the entrepreneurs themselves, talking to people within the film space, people that I was working with that were storytellers. A lot of these things helped me formulate these ideas backed by scientific research. And there are 3 things that's the reason that stories work so well boils down to 3 things. It's the DNA that we are created with, the brain, and then the heart. First, when we talk about the DNA, one of the things you have to understand is that since we have roamed the earth, stories have been an integral part of how we communicated as a species. And when you talk to anthropologists, they will tell you that in every culture on the planet, there is evidence, some form of fashion of storytelling within that particular tribe or that particular culture. And one of the reasons for that is that we used different types of mostly visual storytelling, even before language was developed, to warn people of danger or protect the tribe from the weather elements, or let them know where there's opportunity for food and shelter would be. So essentially, it was a way to survive. And then eventually, it became this knowledge transfer that we used from verbal stories and eventually went to written stories. The next iteration of that, as we evolved as a species, let me go back, is from the time you are born, and even when you're in the womb, there's a high probability that your parents or your grandparents, your babysitter, all the way in kindergarten, preschool, you have been exposed to stories, because that's how the primary communication happens in the early stages of development. But even from primary into secondary education, people are using stories to communicate information. So we've got it buried in our DNA. It's how we transferred knowledge over the generations of a population on this earth. And then we as a society have decided to educate individuals from kindergarten, preschool, and primary and secondary school in the
I mean, I just got home a little while ago and I've been,
optimize the learning process. And then think about what you're consuming every single day. Whether you're scrolling through social media, you're reading a book, you're binge watching a television show, you're going to movies, you were constantly exposed to stories. So we as a species use stories to interpret life and to communicate things that are important to us. The second part, because our brain, our DNA, it's part of who we are, the brain now uses stories to make sense of information. And there are studies that will prove all of these things I'm going to share with you. And one of the things that's really fascinating is that if I share a fact or piece of data with you solely individually, it's going to hit about 2 parts of the brain. However, if I iterate that same information in a compelling story, I'm going to trigger 6 to 7 different parts of the brain because you're listening to what I'm saying, how I'm saying, the details that I'm throwing in there. If I'm talking about the taste of an orange or the smell of a cedar or just the feeling of a soft velvet couch, I'm triggering different parts of your brain. So I have a higher probability of relating to you on simply the synapses in the brain's firing. And if I tell you that same information, you're 6 times more likely to remember it if I'm embedding that information in a story, as opposed to just sharing that raw information in and of itself. And there's this really fascinating thing that happens. And there's a neuroscientist by the name of Uri Hassan who has a lab in New Jersey. And they have this kind of structured setting where they're able to show you in real time how the brain interprets information. And then one side of the room, they'll have a storyteller telling a really compelling story. On the other side of the room, they're going to have people listening, and they have these MFRI caps on, so you can watch their brain wavelengths and the inaxes and the synapses while it's going on. Now, when the storyteller is sitting there quiet and the listeners are there quiet, their brains, there's no relationship or pattern recognition between the two. But as the individual starts sharing their story, the listeners and the storyteller's brain weights start linking up. They start going like this, and eventually they're going like this at exactly the same wavelength. And we call it the mirror effect, because and we've all experienced this. If you've ever been sitting in a really good, like adrenaline pumping movie in the theater, and you feel your heartbeat raising, or you're sitting there reading a book all by yourself that's super sad and a tear starts welling up, or maybe you're binge watching a television show that's making you laugh and you know the ending, you know you've seen it before, but you still, your emotions are drawn up. That's the same thing that this lab is able to capture. It's called the mirror effects. So what's happening, the storyteller is connecting with the audience on a mental level and all these synapses that are firing. And this is what leads to the most important part. And the reason we tell stories, and if there's anything I want you to walk away from today, has to do with emotions. So what happens when you share a compelling story, chemicals get released in the brain because of these synapses get firing. So cortisol, that's a chemical that keeps us alive, keeps us alert. And this does go back to early man in the sense of it alerted us from danger, kept us available for our opportunities. Oxytocin, that's the love chemical. This is the one that makes you want to hug people. This particular chemical was developed inside us as humans because if you were ever ostracized from the tribe, you would die. Individuals could not survive in the early days of man on the planet. So oxytocin is a chemical that makes you want to be with others. And dopamine makes you want something that you really like. If you eat like a sugar hit, chocolate, things like chocolate, drugs, and sex release the same chemicals that stories do. And that's why it's so powerful. And that's why we can have this visceral feeling when we actually are hearing a really good story. And there's one other fascinating concept that I've learned over the last 5 years in the health and wellness space, is there's one chemical in particular called nitric oxide. When you hear a really good story, you feel this love feeling, you want more of it. But also, if you've ever felt a really compelling story in your heart, and you can literally feel it in your heart, it has to do with nitric oxide. Because when you hear that great story, it makes the heart swell because it's a vasodilation chemical. So that's why your heart feels a really good story. And at the end of the day, all of these stories is what they're doing is they're triggering chemicals and those chemicals relate to these emotions. And one of the most important things that has to do with why we tell stories, because they trigger emotions, is at the end of the day, emotions influence the decisions we make as humans. And there's this really famous study, and it was actually a surgery that happened by Dr. Antonio Damasio. He had this patient, and this was probably in the 40s or 50s, that he was a very successful businessman within the community, married, a couple kids, church-going person, well-known, well-liked, and they discovered that he had a brain tumor. But Dr. Antonio Damasio said, we can operate, we can remove it. It is a high probability that you'll be fine. And they did exactly that. They removed the tumor, but they had to cut this particular area within the brain that connected the emotions that he had, essentially. I'm shortcutting what happened, but he no longer had emotional aspect because they cut those areas of the brain out or snipped those little elements. And he still scored from an aptitude test in the 97th percentile after the surgery. But unfortunately, his world fell apart. He couldn't make decisions. He couldn't decide what tie to wear, where to go for lunch, what pen to sign a paper with, because he couldn't make these simple decisions because there was no influence that his emotions normally would have allowed him to make decisions on. And it was that particular surgery that led to a series of experiments that now scientists know that you may think in your mind that you're making an analytical based decision, but ultimately that gut feeling, it's based on emotions. And that's why it's so important that we use stories to target the emotions that we have in the audience that we're trying to reach. And I'm gonna, before I move on, any questions on how that works or some of the science there? Happy to dive into that if anybody has any. We're good. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. So now this boiled this down to where I believe you guys can benefit from that science, my research, and everything I've learned from filming over 1,000 entrepreneurs in the last couple decades. Most important thing your story has to do, you got to capture their attention, and you got to do that at the beginning. If you don't, high probability your story is not going to work. Secondly, you've got to make connection with that audience, give them a reason to care. And then thirdly, at the end of the story, we're trying to trigger a reaction to get them to support us in one way, shape, or form. And I'm going to use a local entrepreneur here in Austin, Texas. His name is Clayton Christopher. He's the founder of Sweet Leaf Tea. And I'm going to share with you his story and break it down along those three elements so that you can take specifically from what someone like Clayton, who started from scratch, mind you, and $10,000 and then built a 9-figure brand over the course of the next 15 years. So Clayton was living in Miami or somewhere in the Florida, and he was a boat captain. And on the weekends, he would go bike riding. Whenever he went bike riding, he'd stop and have some food or drink. And he discovered this really great Southern sweet tea called Milo's tea. And he fell in love with it because really we didn't have anything like that in Texas. It's kind of a homemade type, really great tea. At the time, there was Nestle and maybe one or two other brands. Lipton and Nestle had bottled iced tea. Everything else, you had to make it yourself. But he discovered this Milo's tea, and he really fell in love with it. So he decided to come back to Texas. He's going to launch his own tea brand. And he had his grandmother's recipe. Mimi was his grandmother. He decided to take her recipe and start making this tea. And then when they started out, they used crawfish pots, and they used garden hoses and pillowcases to kind of brew it up and then filter it. And then they would go to Home Depot, and to put the caps on top of the bottle, they'd buy drills and make it so their hands were getting tired along those lines. So it was this really kind of, out of the garage type of startup. They did really well in terms of, it took them 15 years. Mind you, this was not an overnight success. But he learned how to expand the number of doors that they in, connect with the different buyers, get press. And he always talked about his story and the power of it. And they eventually got bought by Nestle for over $100 million. So what he used in terms of that first point that I made is that even when they started, there were still a lot of competition for soft drinks or any type of refreshment beverages, which is the category that they were, the bottled tea category, if you will. So what you want to think about with your story is what can you do to break through the noise? Either that's novelty, or you're going to strike the curiosity, or maybe you're disrupting a category because of the ingredients that you have, or the convalescence of two categories where you're putting some type of product with another product together that nobody else has. So in the case of Clayton, what he always does on a regular basis, whenever they give their pitch out, they'd always talk about brewing the tea in crawfish pots, using garden hoses to transfer it from the teapots, and they would filter it with pantyhose and with pillowcases. So you may say that's kind of flippant and kind of catchy. It worked because people love that at the time. Think about who he's competing with. Corporate America and Nestle and Lipton. These two big giants that we only knew by commercials at this particular time. And you'd see those all over the grocery store. But here's this guy, bootstrapping and making it in crawfish pots and garden hoses and really disrupting kind of this category, if you will, by having a homegrown type of product. The next thing he did in terms of that was kind of his way to get attention, was have a clever, fun story. So the second thing he did was use that story to connect with audiences, because when the connection always comes down to you want to reach people on an emotional level. You want to pull those heartstrings one way, shape, or form. So as he came up with that particular storyline, he ended up using that on the back of their bottle. You can see here, they signed it, Clayton David, that was his co-founder. It was a really simple story that he shared. They had a picture of it. Our product is just water, tea leaves, and sugarcane. And they talked about Mimi's grandma's tea. And one of the things that I was fortunate early on, and as a producer, I got to film a lot of their events. So I was with Clayton and his brand ambassadors. They called them tea slingers was the acronym they called everybody. And they would go to concerts. They'd go to running events, triathlons, anywhere where there was people thirsty and outdoors. In Texas, we got that going on all the time. So he used that story on the bottle. He used it himself. Every single employee knew that story like the back of their hand. Every brand ambassador would pass out gimmicks that had grandma's face on it, or they had a picture of the bottle. So it was a very relatable story. I mean, who doesn't love grandma's tea? And who can't fall in love with kind of the romanticism of crawfish pots and pantyhose, pillowcases, and garden hoses? So he used the simplicity of that story in a relatable way, every touch point that he had with his customer as a way to build that emotional connection. And the way he talked about it is he knew if he got it past their lips, they were hooked because the tea was so much better than the commercial teas at the time. So his goal with telling this story, having it very relatable, and at every touch point and at every employee, was to convince them to taste the tea. So tastings were a big part of what they did, but using that story at every opportunity was how they got them to taste it. And the third part about this, I talked about you want to trigger a reaction. And Tom was talking about, and I asked him a question about who your audiences are. These are investors, these are buyers, these are consumers. You've got a variety, and I have a CPG company that I own as well. So I've been in the trenches of knowing exactly what that's like on all aspects of those different customer groups. You need to make your story relevant to the target audience. It's fine and dandy to talk about crawfish pots and garden hoses and pantyhose and that type of thing. That's a fun little kitschy story. But now, because when we're moving from a consumer audience into an investor or a retail buyer, you've got to make it relevant to them so they understand, well, how is this going to make you unique? Where's the revenue going to come from? What are the margins? So you're looking for a way to reach them on a personal level or something that's going to trigger a reaction in them. And in their case, what they ended up doing is, if you look at this picture here, the way that they kind of, and I actually still have a bottle, they don't make these bottles anymore. This is my cherished bottle. They would take the competitors' products with them sometimes, and they would show the back of the bottles right here. And it's really difficult to see because the whiteness here. But if you looked on the orange or the dark ones here, this one right here, whoop, where are we going? This one. Okay, if you can see that, there's a lot of ingredients. That's the number of ingredients. You can't pronounce half those things, and you don't know what the other ones are. But if you look at his, which is on the screen here, and it's also right there, filtered water, organic cane sugar, well, organic black tea, and citric acid. That's it. So you had a paragraph versus a sentence, and he knew what everything was in the sentence. You could pronounce it, you knew what it was. There wasn't red dye number 72, carbon dioxide, ethanol, and the other type of drinks that we're seeing out there. So from a positioning standpoint, this is a value proposition that he talks about his grandmother's recipe with these very simple ingredients. And we're going against these corporate products with ingredients, you know what they are. So he turns this kitschy little story into a positioning statement who articulates why they're unique and different. And he would bring tea into these meetings, whether it was a buyer, whether it was an investor, and he would have them side by side. And I remember specifically, I didn't know what he meant by how much better could it be. But when you taste them side by side, it's like drinking syrup versus sweet tea when you have them truly these very distinct differences. So this is a case where he's using this to pitch it initially from consumers. And obviously he didn't do this right away. He developed this skill set over time, and he's articulating to the buyers and to the investors why their product's unique, who the buyer is, what they care about. In this case, they cared about organic products, black tea and cane sugar, ingredients that were healthy or at least not unhealthy along those lines. And then he's able to position the brand in this beautiful homemade type thing. So they were selling and not only just grocery stores, but more on that relatable natural food store or different things like that. So it's a lot more of a crowded market now that you have to deal with, but these principles still apply. You're trying to understand what makes your story not only compelling to listen to, but how can I weave that narrative into the differentiation so people understand why we're unique, how we're going to position within the market, and why customers are going to buy it because of those positioning elements and those needs. So one of the things I always encourage with founders, executives of companies, and especially in this consumer packaged goods space, you need to keep your story as simple as possible, but have the ability to tailor it to a particular audience, whether that's a buyer, a consumer, or members of the press, or an investor in this particular case. The other thing he's able to do, if we were to bring out the presentation he would make at that particular time, when he'd bring out the financials, he would talk about how over time, because of the very few ingredients, the simple manufacturing process, obviously scaling up from the crawfish pots into vats, what they use in a commercial grade, but he's able to articulate to them the financial model was woven directly from the narrative because they're going to be able to save costs over time and keep them positioned as the leader in kind of the natural type of bottled tea kind of category along those lines. So the three takeaways I want you to embody from these slides is the reason we tell stories is because they trigger emotions with the body. Cortisol, any type of love chemical or something that makes dopamine that makes you want more of something, or nitric oxide that makes the heart swell. Those things influence the brain because emotions influence decisions. We like to think that we make decisions based on the analytical side of our brain, but we now know with science that it's almost always an emotional reaction based on your past knowledge, your past influences, your past biases, that you're going to make your decision on a product or service. So you want to tap into those biases. You want to tap into these emotions so you can influence them to support you in one way, shape, or form. And then those three things that I ended on, you got to grab their attention. It's the most important thing, because if you don't grab their attention in the beginning, they're either on to the next thing or you're going to be fighting to get their attention back. And you got to do that at the beginning of your story. Do something that's going to disrupt the narrative, strike their curiosity, reach them at the core, then make an emotional connection with your story, speak to something that's important to them or people that they care about, or someone they know that might want to hear about your product or service. And then lastly, give them a reason to support what you're doing, because you understand the value proposition very well. Your differentiation has been articulated extremely in a way that people understand it, or simply there's something you can even do. Think about this. One of the reasons that people do time-sensitive opportunities or projects or sales, much like what happens times Black Friday, you are triggering a reaction in them because they know they have a limited time window to react or they're not going to get it. So it's human psyche is this last part, this reaction that I talk about. So get their attention, make that connection, bridge those emotional heartstrings, and then do something that's going to trigger a reaction in them along those lines. This is my book. Everything I just said here, I poured my heart into this book. You can scan this QR code if you want to check it out. I have a newsletter. Tom, I think you'll be passing out or giving me emails so I can share that afterwards along those lines. But I want to save the rest of the time for me here to answer any questions that you guys have and dive into these concepts. I've been really fortunate over the last 5 to 7 years to be a mentor at 3 different accelerators: a consumer packaged goods accelerator, a tech founders accelerator, and then Anderson Horowitz accelerator. So I have a lot of experience mentoring folks in the early stage, and can give you a lot of feedback that I've learned that helps these companies go from ideas to product, from product to sales, from sales to growth. So happy to entertain any questions you guys have in that category.
So I'll start up here. I put your website in the chat, so please go there and sign up for Lynn's newsletter, and you'll find out more about the book there too. I've got one question to start us off, Lynn, if that's okay, and then folks can go from there. You know, it's that we all have sort of this common DNA. We have commonality in many things, like you mentioned, grandmothers and things like that. You know, we all have this commonality. Yet, when a brand has a product, and that product, you know, has to, if they want to grow big, they're going to have to connect with a lot of people. Sometimes that product's based on functionality. Sometimes that's product's based on mission. Often the product's simply just based on taste and how good it is, and you know, but there's a driving number of factors. What's that iteration process that a founder should go through to find out what is connecting and what his or her market is really going to be, as they sort of figure out who is actually listening to that story and connecting with that story? What's that iteration process like?
To me, there's 2 different ways to approach it. One, you take on one side of the equation, imagine you got a whiteboard or just a blank piece of paper. I have this clipboard I use, and I just always write ideas on it. And you want to think about what are the most compelling attributes about your product or service that people are going to love, you've been told about it, or you think is the most important thing that they can benefit from one way, shape, or form. And you want to list all those things, everything you can think of. And then at the same time, you want to circle the most important elements from those. If you've got a list of 10, you got to narrow it down to 7, then to 5, and then to 3. In the early days, you're not going to know really which one consumers or buyers or investors are going to resonate with. You've got a hunch, you probably have a good idea, but it's very difficult to know that until you've been in the market, until you've tested it out, and you've had a number of people tell you no, or buy it, or give you really candid feedback. So that's why it's important, I think, to narrow it down to 3 things. When you start growing, I had this really interesting conversation with the CMO at Vital Farms when they were trying to scale their business. And they understood that people love their product for a lot of different reasons. And they eventually narrowed it down to 3 different attributes that they settled on. And they had a persona built for each one of those three attributes. Unfortunately, they discovered, and this was surprising to me, even though I've been doing this for a while, I says it was too much. To grow at the scale that they wanted to grow, 3 was too many things to talk about. So they started doing testing. It's like, okay, we're going to bet the farm, so to speak, if you will, on one particular attribute. And it ended up being how they treated their humane aspect to animals from that perspective. That was the one that resonated most with their test groups. It was resonating the most with their marketing and online and offline type things. So they really put all their eggs, again, pun intended, in one basket here. And it enabled them to grow at for a period of time. That is where they really grew Vital Farms into the brand that we all know and most of us love today, because they decided to, instead of focusing on 3 things, focus on one thing. But it is very difficult in the beginning to do that, because you really don't have the luxury of knowing which one's going to be the best. So what I recommend, and what I've seen founders be successful at, is if you're doing tasting in a store, at a farmer's market, or you've got online campaigns that you can have digital feedback, is just as quickly as you can, try to test 3, maybe 2, and then over time you'll get down to 1. And so it's combination of time. You start with everything, and then you want to get to one thing, and it's this journey of narrowing and narrowing and narrowing it down until you've got those 1, 2, and 3 things. It doesn't mean you can't talk about the other elements. It just means you have to recognize that consumers, buyers, and investors, they just got an attention span. That's the 8-second goldfish story we've all heard. They just have so many things coming at them. They're not going to remember all 3. And if you try to tell them 3 or 4 or 5, they're not going to remember anything. So it's better to say 1 and lean on that.
Thank you for that. I think Carolyn has a question, so I'm going to open the floor up to her.
Hi, Lynn.
I like all the colors. Got the green background. You got your colors popping. Nice work, man. I'm all about putting that brand out there. Well done.
Great, thank you. Well, we're new and we just launched on Amazon about a month ago. But I wanted to make one comment and also ask you a question. The comment is, I have also found what's interesting is my 86-year-old mother has cognitive decline. And when we want her to remember things like when somebody's coming to pick her up or things like that, it's putting it in the context of a story that allows her to remember it. Facts, they don't remember. So it's an interesting, the brain works in mysterious ways, but this also works when you have memory issues in putting things in context of stories, which, as you said, is why things get passed down from generation to generation. So anyway, I don't need to dwell on that, but just that resonated with me. And I've tried to impart that in real life with my mother. So second question is—
Thanks for sharing that, Kim. That's awesome. Love it.
Yeah, no, it works. I mean, if you tell her someone's picking her up at 10 o'clock to take her to the airport, instead of her calling me at 11 saying no one's here yet when they told her it was 11, there's a better way to do that. So, and that's happened more times than once. But I do want to know, are you working with early stage brands? And if so, how?
Yes. Generally in a mentor capacity within the accelerators that I'm in, but I also have had clients hire me specifically. And one of the exercises that we go through, it depends kind of where they're at on their story creation journey. So I just worked with a company that has it is a hydration supplement that they've added elements to it that make it unique and different because they're borrowing from other categories, not just hydration, they're borrowing from other categories. And they went through one of the programs that I was mentoring. And their story was, and she's got a good story. It's her and her husband. She's got a really good story, but it was a little bit raw, if you will. And she's more of a scientist, doctor category. So she's not, and she's self-proclaimed not a storyteller. I told her, quit saying that. We're all good storytellers. We just got to find her voice. One of the things that we did was I had her take an inventory of everything that she had done, because she had a long career before she got into consumer packaged goods. And it was a very impressive career, mind you. And she complains sometimes that there are all these young whippersnappers that are 20-something-year-old and they're sticking adaptogens in their mushroom coffee. And I told her, I said, what I want you to do is I want you to lean into that, because you have this incredibly impressive accomplishments from a professional standpoint that helped lead you to the product that you've developed. And it's this credentials document that I have them work on. And I just have them list all the credentials they've done over the years, everything they can think of, awards, accolades, metrics about their accomplishments, and then also the company's accomplishments. So what we do is we take that information and we're cherry picking the best elements from that credentials list. And this can, for some seasoned executives, I've got one guy 5 pages long because he'd been 30 years in corporate America. And we're cherry picking the 2 or 3 things that I believe they're going to help bring credibility to the story, to get an investor because they're specifically focused on fundraising. Why are they unique and different from a product standpoint? And we're blending in her experience with a particular type of health element and why that has been integrated into this hydration supplement in such a way that they're not just adding some type of adaptogen. What they've done is they're integrating that 20 plus years of experience of using a particular ingredient. And then this is why the product was developed in such a way. And then they're adding it to this growth particular market category. So we're taking metrics about their accomplishments, and we're trying to enhance their story because of the experience that they have, that not only makes what they're doing stand out, it gives them more credibility, as opposed to some 25-year-old person that read about a particular adaptation and decided to add it to their product. She had conceptual industry knowledge that helped her better articulate to the investors why her product, and why they're going to win.
I have a very similar, not exactly story, because my background is all finance and this is my first CPG foray, and I'm obviously an older founder. And we have a better for you energy gummy snack that, you know, is non-GMO, we're made with almost all organic ingredients, and we have functionally enhanced it with goji berry. So goji berry for antioxidants. We're the first to ever put coconut water into a gummy, and we're also a good source of dietary fiber. So we've borrowed from other categories as well to give you sort of, you know, an indulgence that's somewhat not guilt-free, but close to guilt-free. So I've done sort of the same, and, you know, come from another realm. So that's interesting on how to try to figure out how to tie those together. I don't have specific scientists or any type of that, but just tying different things together is helpful.
One of the things that you're going to have is you're going to have a seasoned experience at problem solving. And one thing that we all tend to overcomplicate at times is that usually the best startup stories at their simple core, problem solution. I mean, that it is. You are solving a problem in the market for a particular group of customers or a market segment that is unique and different, that you need to articulate. So one challenge you'll have is you focus so much on the product of not just you, this is most founders, you forget about what problem all you're solving. So what you can do is talk about, look, I have got 25 years in financial services or whatever particular category you came from, and what we did was we solved problems, and then you kind of relate that, and we solved them really well. I'm making this up, right?
Yeah.
But what you're able to do is we identified this hole in the market where you've got people that wanted a healthy snack that not only, you know, for me, I got a huge sweet tooth, so I always have sweet teeth or sweet stuff around me all the time.
I have to send them to you.
I would love to try it. Love to try it. So you've got this, you're solving that sweet tooth fix, but at the same time, you're giving them an alternative to taking a pharmaceutical, or maybe they don't want to take a vitamin in the morning, or they don't want to add a supplement to their protein shake. You're giving them something that's going to make their life easier, less complicated, and healthier at the same time. And you're going to give them a smile, because who doesn't love that sweet? I mean, whenever I think of sweets, I think of smiling. So don't overcomplicate the value proposition. Is that you're solving a problem for a very specific customer. You want to identify that customer. Here's this hair on fire problem. Busy people who eat crap, who forget to take their vitamins, and then all of a sudden they collapse. They're at an IV center, and they're trying to do all those things. And then you're able to and you can also weave this into a personal story. Like, I was one of those people. I would go, and then over the holidays, I'd crash and burn and get sick over at Thanksgiving or Christmas. I know this, my best friend does this all the time. She's a high-profile business executive, and then she crashes. So I've been working on her health for the last couple of years. I finally got her to the point where she doesn't get sick, but a few times a year. But she used to get sick every time she had a break. So
Sounds like my college-age son.
That's the way I was in college.
this is how you weave in your personal experience, either you personally or someone that you know, through a problem you've identified in the market that you're solving specifically with your solution. And what makes your solution unique is everything you just went down the point. The habit we all get into is we want to talk about our features. We want to talk about what makes it different right away, when the audience doesn't know what the problem you're solving is yet. So unless you identify the problem, then you're going to have a harder time making your solution appealing in that perspective.
No, I agree, because I've read some of Donald Miller's stuff. So, but you're right. I didn't present that even to you in that effective way. So thank you.
Yeah. Donald Miller's great. I mean, his brand problem is really good. The one difference I'll say is that in his stuff versus what I teach is that entrepreneurship is personal. It is a very big endeavor to start a company. And a lot of people say delineate your personality, your life, everything you're doing. I'm like the exact opposite. I'm like, screw that. Like I'm here. I bet my life, I bet my savings, I bet my relationship with my significant other on this business. And let me tell you why. So whenever you get into Dollar Miller stuff, they're giving you templates and brand marketing and all that stuff is important. And when you mature to a certain point where the company doesn't need your face, your name, voice, it works really well. But in the early stages, every investor you're going to deal with and a lot of the buyers, they're betting on you. They're not betting on the product. They're not betting on the company. So make it personal from that perspective.
Thank you.
Hey,
You're welcome.
Lynn, that led me to think of another question I'd be interested in asking you is what does the founder have to think about as telling the story to the initial investors, the initial consumers, the initial, people that he needs to be interested in his product or his or her product? What happens when that changes to marketing? Are there things they need to think about when it becomes, okay, now that story has to be told in a marketing way, in certain medias? Are there things they need to think about besides honing in on the message? Are they that they need to think about in terms of the best avenues or the best ways to do that or the best ways to make that transition from telling their story to marketing their story?
The recommendation I have on that front is that as you hire people or you are bringing on brand ambassadors or you've got contractors that in one way, shape, or form, they become your voice. They become an extension of the brand. You have to empower them. So it's not like you need to wait on this. It's something because they're going to tell your story, but at the end of the day, where they're on the front lines, they need to speak from a confident standpoint. And that subtle communication sharing when you're bridging who the brand is, what the ethos of the brand is, where it's me, and then you're making it them, and you're really empowering them. That process is the same exact process of that transition you just said from telling your story towards marketing your story. Is that what's the ethos of the brand? What do we stand for? The target audience is still the same. The attributes of the product are still the same. So that all hasn't changed, but it's no longer my story. It's no longer Lynn Graft did this. It's more
Our story.
our story. It's storytelling for entrepreneurs, helps founders learn how to create and tell great stories. And the way we do that is it becomes I to we. It's the to us, that type of thing. And one of the most important things you can do is have other people tell you about your brand. If they can articulate your brand to you, you're like, damn, that was good. I should hire you to go speak for me. If you're saying that, you've done it right. If you're like, yeah, that's not, it's your fault. It's really fascinating. It's like if they're not able to spit back what you want them to say, it's because you're not communicating it in the way that you should be. And that comes down to simplicity. It comes down to getting their attention, and making that emotional connection in such a way. So one of the things I love about storytelling is it's kind of like the telephone game that we played as kids, is that if it gets worse and worse and worse, it's because you started out with something that was probably too complicated along the way. But if someone can tell that story to another person, to another person, to another person, then you're doing something right. And I'll give you this example that my buddies approached me about 3 years ago here in Austin, Texas. And they actually got their product right here because I'm putting this I have a short-term rental in my car, in my backyard. It's just a nice little bungalow house. And I always give them some local CPG flavors. And this is a ready-to-drink cocktail. It's called Big Hat. And he approached me a couple years ago saying, hey, we got this idea for a ready-to-drink cocktail. And we're going to name this. I'm like, oh, Mike, don't do it. That's the most competitive space outside of water. Do not do a canned cocktail. Because at the time, it was exploding and every major brand out there from Bacardi to Budweiser,
Yep.
all of them were launching products that were the exact same thing because these startups had done really well and they exploded. And everyone's like, well, wine and beer is going down. We're going to make canned cocktails. And I told him, I said, don't do it. And he goes, I hear you. But let me tell you the name. And this is like 20 minutes. He's like building up the name. I'm like, the name of the company is called Big Hat. Big Hat Spirits. I'm like, okay, we're in Texas. That's a good name, but still don't do it. I don't like that along those lines. And so we got in this discussion about the name, like, yeah, that's a great name, really cool, embodies the Texas spirit. And the idea was, oh, and then he said the tagline. And he said the tagline was inspired by legends, enjoyed by friends. I'm like, oh, yeah, that's really good. I was like, inspired by legend, enjoyed by friends. And it says that, on here and on the can and all that. And I'm like, okay. And then I got to taste the product. I'm like, all right, this stuff is really good. You got a great name, great tagline. And then he dove into how they were going to launch to the market. And they decided it was because it's legends in Texas are musicians, they're athletes, even special forces. So they really aligned with musical groups like the Singer-Songwriters Association of Texas. Same thing with Nashville. They aligned with the University of Texas. They aligned with some other college teams. They put special forces and they were putting them on their cans because now we have digital print capabilities to create unique runs of these cans. And I'm like, man, this is really good. Great name, great tagline, great product. And they're positioning it towards a target audience that's going to really, as long as the product is good, then it's going to work with them. And it's one of those fascinating discoveries of how you enter a crowded market with a really good product that it doesn't matter how good your product is. You have to have a good product. That's like, no, but they're able to take the attributes of the product. And from a marketing, this is marketing 101. This is not rocket science. It's flavored with kombucha. That was their sweetener. That was probably the biggest differentiator that they had. And it was unique. It was a really great way, almost like a case study. I'm be eager to see how they do in the next 2 years because it's still a very competitive space.
Excellent. Thank you for that. That was a great story. We are out of time. You have all the contact information for Lynn and for his website and where you can sign up for his newsletter in the chat. You can reach out to me at tom@brandjectory.com. I can connect you up with Lynn. Or if you have any other questions, we're happy to take those. But I want to thank Lynn. This has been really special for Susan and I to have this chance finally to really hear from him outside of watching his videos on LinkedIn and some other places. So are excited to have this opportunity, and this has really been fascinating. And I really thank you, Lynn, for being here today, and really appreciate it.
Yeah, I really want to thank you and Susan. You guys do a great job giving people valuable knowledge in this space, helping them kind of on their journey. As Carolyn's a perfect example, there's so much to learn in a short period of time.
And that's what we're here for. That's exactly what we're here for.
As a founder in consumer packaged goods, you have to learn all the disciplines. It's one of the simplest but most complicated business categories I've ever been in. I had no idea.
And as much as you know business, you don't know CPG until you're in it. Okay. I have a 30-year banking career, and CPG was still different than my 30-year banking career.
Yeah, so different, so different.
For
And
sure.
the one thing that really drives me bananas is that it never stops. It's just consumers are very picky. They always want more than you can offer, and there's
Very fickle.
It's very fickle. So yeah, it's a good on you for out there empowering these founders and executives for that. So thank you.
That's what we're here to do. And if anybody needs more information, Caroline on here is a member of Brandjectory, Carolyn, and we're excited to talk to anybody. Again, I advise you to go out to Lynn, sign up for his newsletter. These are things you want to know and that will help you when you're talking to investors, talking to buyers, and when you're talking to and trying to get, to the point of messaging your consumer effectively and telling that story and getting them interested in your product. So, Lynn, thank you again for today. We appreciate your help. And if anybody has any questions, reach out to us.
All
Thank
right.
you all.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Everybody have a
Thank
great
you.
day.
Okay, bye now.
Bye.